A Tuesday afternoon in Malibu, Pacific Coast Highway, the ocean on one side, a line of parked cars on the other. A black Lincoln Navigator drifts out of its lane, crosses several lanes of oncoming traffic, and slams into a parked truck just short of the bluff. Inside is a 76-year-old man who, deputies say, told him he blacked out behind the wheel. His name is Gene Simmons. And for once, the headline isn't about a lawsuit, a feud, or a quote he wishes he could take back. It's about whether the man behind rock's most famous demon face is finally running out of road. That crash on October 7th, 2025 is real, it's documented, and it's only one thread in a run of headlines that have followed Simmons through the back half of 2025 and into 2026. A stretch that included a Senate hearing, an apology for something he said about a dead bandmate, and a viral clip telling fellow celebrities to shut up about politics. This is a story of how Gene Simmons, at 76, became news again, and why, this time, it doesn't feel like part of the act. Before he was a demon spitting blood on stage, Gene Simmons was a boy named Heimwitz, born in Haifa, Israel, in 1949. His mother, a Hungarian Jewish woman, had survived the Holocaust. That history followed the family across an ocean when Simmons and his mother immigrated to New York in the late 1950s, settling in Queens. He arrived speaking almost no English and, by his own account in interviews over the years, taught himself the language by absorbing comic books, television reruns, and radio DJs, teaching himself not just vocabulary, but how to perform confidence itself. By the late 1960s, the boy who'd gone from Heimwitz to Gene Klein had renamed himself once more Gene Simmons, and was playing a string of unremarkable New York rock bands. In 1970, he met Stanley Eisen, the future Paul Stanley, and the two eventually formed a group called Wicked Lester before scrapping it entirely in 1972. What emerged in its place, by January 1973, was Kiss, for unknown musicians in face paint who played their first show to fewer than a dozen people at a club in Queens. What followed is well-documented rock history. Kiss built itself into a merchandising empire as much as a band, with the demon persona Simmons created becoming one of the most recognizable characters in American entertainment. Inducted into the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame in 2014, honored with a star on the Hollywood Walk of Fame in 2001, and, as of December 2025, recognized at the Kennedy Center Honors alongside bandmates Paul Stanley and Peter Criss. That last honor is where the current chapter of the Simmons story really begins. Kiss's founding lead guitarist, Ace Frehley, died in October 2025 after a fall at his home in Morristown, New Jersey, that caused a skull fracture, brain bleed, and stroke. He was 74. Frehley had been open for nearly 2 decades about his sobriety, crediting it with keeping his career alive well into his 70s. In December, on the same day he, Stanley, and Criss reunited to accept the Kennedy Center honor, Simmons gave an interview to the New York Post in which he questioned whether Frehley's death was really as simple as the autopsy suggested. Site index equals 9-1. Simmons said Frehley had refused advice from people who cared about him, including Simmons himself, to change his lifestyle, and argued that a fall down the stairs alone shouldn't be fatal. /site, he added that there may have been other issues, calling it heartbreaking, and closed with a line that struck many as harsh for the moment, that Frehley had reaped what he'd sown. The remarks landed badly, and not just because of their timing. Site index equals 9-1. Frehley had accused Simmons back in 2019 of making slanderous claims about his past substance abuse, and the public record didn't support the idea that addiction played a role in his final years. /site fans and commentators accused Simmons of using a bandmate's death to relitigate an old grudge. On the very day Kiss was being celebrated at one of the country's most prestigious cultural honors, days later, Simmons walked it back. Site index equals 6-1. In a social media post, he admitted he'd chosen the wrong words and apologized for them directly. /site, it wasn't the first time. Simmons had gone through a similar cycle in 2016, after he called Prince's overdose death pathetic, and later apologized following criticism from his own family and from Stanley. The pattern is consistent enough that it's become its own kind of story. Simmons says something sharp about how another artist died, faces immediate backlash, and eventually offers a version of contrition, sincere or strategic, depending on who you ask. The Frehley comments weren't the only thing putting Simmons in headlines that week. Just before the interview published, Simmons had testified before the Senate Judiciary Committee in Washington, D.C., in support of the American Music Fairness Act, legislation that would require terrestrial radio stations to pay artists and songwriters a larger share of royalties for airplay. Site index equals 7-1. Simmons argued that radio stations brought in something like $14 billion a year prior, while artists featured on those stations made nothing. /site. It's a real and long-running grievance in the music industry. Unlike satellite and streaming platforms, AM/FM radio in the United States doesn't pay a performance royalty to the recording artist, only to songwriters and publishers. That much of Simmons' argument tracks with the facts. But in making that case, he reached for a comparison that overshadowed everything else he said. Site index equals 6-1. Simmons told a room that once people realized how artists were being treated, they'd see it was worse than slavery, because at least slaves were given food and water, while legends like Elvis, Sinatra, and Bing Crosby got nothing for their radio performances. /site. The clip spread fast, and the reaction was what you'd expect. Critics called the comparison offensive and tone-deaf, regardless of how legitimate the underlying royalty complaint was. It's a pattern that's defined Simmons for years, bearing a real point under comparison, so extreme that the point itself gets lost in the outrage. He's done versions of this before, most famously in his decade-plus campaign against hip-hop artists being inducted into the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame, arguing repeatedly that rap doesn't belong in what he considers a guitar-based institution. If the Fraley comments in the Senate remark were about grief and grievance, Simmons' next headline-grabbing moment was about something else entirely, politics, and his increasingly public irritation with celebrities who weigh in on it. Appearing on CNN in December 2025, site index equals 7-1. Simmons described his relationship with Donald Trump as terrific and argued that Americans spend too much energy worrying about what their neighbors believe politically, adding that it isn't anyone's business who a person supports. /site, he'd go further a few months later. In an interview with TMZ, site index equals 8-1, Simmons told actors like Mark Ruffalo and Ben Stiller to stop voicing political opinions, arguing that people who work hard for a living don't want to be lectured by entertainers living in mansions and driving Rolls Royces, and that it was time for the entertainment industry to do its art and stay quiet. /site index equals 8-1. He singled out Ruffalo by name, mispronouncing along the way, and suggested reporters ask Kylie Jenner for her take on world events instead, as a kind of jab at celebrity punditry generally. /site. It's classic Simmons. Blunt, deliberately provocative, delivered with a shrug rather than an apology. Whether you read it as refreshing candor or as an aging rock star performing outrage for clicks depends entirely on which side of his fan base you're standing on. And that fan base has been split for years. One camp hears a businessman willing to say what others won't. The other hears a man who has built a career out of turning every microphone into a stage for the demon persona, even when the subject is a dead friend or a national election. None of that, though, compares to what happened on October 7th, 2025, a story that had nothing to do with a quote or a controversy, and everything to do with Simmons' age and his health. That afternoon, deputies with the Los Angeles County Sheriff's Department responded to a crash on Pacific Coast Highway in Malibu. Site index equals 10-1. A black Lincoln Navigator had struck a parked vehicle, and the driver may have suffered a medical emergency before the collision. /site index equals 14-1. Simmons was conscious and speaking with first responders when they arrived, and told deputies he'd passed out or fainted just before hitting the parked car. /site, he was taken to a hospital, evaluated, and released the same day. What made the crash more alarming than a routine fender bender was the footage that surfaced afterward. Site index equals 12-1. Video obtained by TMZ showed the SUV had crossed several lanes of traffic and struck a parked truck hard enough to crumple its hood, and that without the truck absorbing the impact. Simmons' vehicle appeared to be headed toward the bluff and the beach below. /site index equals 12-1. Paul Stanley reportedly told TMZ it was a miracle his bandmate survived, and Shannon Tweed, Simmons' wife, said she wouldn't get in a car with him behind the wheel again. /site. Tweed also offered an explanation for what caused a medical episode in the first place. Site index equals 14-1. She told NBC that doctors had recently changed Simmons' medication and had told him he needed to drink significantly more water, something she said he doesn't like doing. Site index equals 16-1. Simmons has also spoken publicly in the past about living with atrial fibrillation, a heart condition causing irregular heart rhythms, which he first experienced while on tour years earlier. Site. Simmons' own response was true to form, dismissive of the drama. Site index equals 13-1. He posted on social media thanking people for their concern, insisting he was completely fine, and describing it as a slight fender bender that happens, especially to horrible drivers like himself. Site weeks later, as coverage of the crash kept circulating, site index equals 24-1. He pushed back publicly on WH, and he characterized as the media blowing the incident out of proportion. Site. That framing, "it happens, I'm fine, the media overhyped it," is a familiar Simmons instinct. Minimize, deflect, move on. It's the same instinct that had him back on stage within minutes after a 2023 show where dehydration forced him to briefly pause and receive medical attention. It's also the instinct that, according to those closest to him, may be part of the problem. A 76-year-old man with a diagnosed heart rhythm condition on new medication, driving alone on one of California's more unforgiving stretches of highway, is not really a small story, even if he'd like it to be. The Malibu incident wasn't the only vehicle-related legal matter attached to the Simmons household this past year. In June 2026, TMZ reported that Simmons and his wife are being sued over a separate accident. Site index equals 19-1. The suit, filed by a man named Evan Brenner, alleges that he suffered severe injuries in July 2024 when his Tesla collided with a vehicle connected to the Simmons family on Sunset Boulevard in Los Angeles. Site index equals 19-1. Brenner claims the crash caused shock to his nervous system, along with significant pain and discomfort, and that he will require ongoing medical treatment, in addition to lost income from his inability to work. Site index equals 19-1. He's seeking both general compensatory damages and special damages tied to medical costs. Site. Details on the Simmons family's account of that specific incident are limited in the public record so far, and the case remains in early stages. What's notable is less the specifics of the lawsuit and more the pattern it fits into. 2 vehicle incidents involving the Simmons household inside 2 years, arriving at a moment when Simmons' touring schedule shows no real sign of slowing down. That's perhaps the strangest thread running through all of this. Simmons is, on paper, retired. Kiss officially played what was billed as its final concert in New York in December 2023, closing out the end of the road tour that had itself been stretched and delayed for years, interrupted at one point when Simmons tested positive for COVID-19 on his 72nd birthday in 2021. But final hasn't meant final. Simmons kept a busy solo touring schedule through 2025, even after postponing more than a dozen dates that spring. A postponement his team was careful to note wasn't health-related at the time. He returned to the road with a statement that says as much about his mindset as anything else he said publicly. He tried to stay away from performing after Kiss wrapped up, but found it was too much fun to give up. In November 2025, weeks after Malibu crash, Simmons, Stanley, and other band alumni reunited in Las Vegas for a 3-day 50th anniversary celebration of Kiss. For a man who fainted behind the wheel of an SUV and nearly went over a cliff into the Pacific, getting back on a stage and back behind the wheel within weeks isn't really a surprise. It's who Gene Simmons has always been. This is a man who taught himself English from comic books because he refused to be an outsider in a country he just landed in. This is a man who built a rock band into a billion-dollar merchandising machine because he saw value where other musicians only saw music. Slowing down has never been part of the plan. Strip away the outrage cycle, the Fraley comments, the worse enslaved remark, the political jabs at Ruffalo and Stiller, and what's left is a man in his late 70s whose body is starting to send signals his instincts don't know how to listen to. The controversies get the headlines, because Simmons has spent 50 years making sure controversy always gets headlines. But the crash on Pacific Coast Highway, the heart condition, the medication change, the second lawsuit, those are a different kind of story. They're not about whether Gene Simmons said something offensive. They're about whether the demon can keep going the way he always has, or whether reality is finally catching up with the character he built. Simmons would likely tell you the answer is obvious. He's fine. It was a fender bender, and the outrage over his words says more about everyone else than it does about him. his wife's account, and the footage from that Malibu crash tell a slightly different story. One where a truck parked on the side of the highway may be the only reason this piece isn't being written about something far worse. Either way, it's clear the last year hasn't been business as usual for Gene Simmons, even by his own standards. The man who spent 5 decades turning every headline into part of the show is now generating headlines he can't spin his way out of quite so easily. And for the first time in a long time, it isn't the controversy that should worry his fans most. It's the highway. Sources: Rolling Stone, Louder Sound / Classic Rock, Consequence, Fox News, NBC News, TMZ, NBC Los Angeles, ABC 7 Los Angeles, Noise 11, Ultimate Classic Rock.